There are some who feel that the PS5 has been an underwhelming console so far. I don't really agree with that. I can understand why it might seem that way though, because I think it can be difficult to discover new good games when so much of the gaming press and all the big YouTube channels insist on just chasing easy clicks by saturating their coverage with the same 4 or 5 over-marketed games every year. But that's where I come in, and I happen to think we've seen the PS5's library blossom quite well over the last couple of years, especially in their selection of more straight-up action games. Most PS5 owners probably already know about the big ones though, so here I want to talk about some action games that some folks might have missed out on, or might be under the wrong impression about for whatever reason. So if you've ever found your taste aligning with mine, you should probably give these a look. Bandai Namco, or as I just call them, Namco, has been on a roll over the past couple of years, and part of that is because they're always willing to, at least every now and then, put out something completely new and different. One of those more recent, newer IPs is Scarlet Nexus, and I happen to think this is one of the best games Namco has put out in a long time, although I have to admit it was a bit of an acquired taste for me. I started out playing it on PS4, and that's not the way I recommend playing it. The combat is intricate and fast and extremely chaotic, so playing it at 30 frames per second on the PS4 just doesn't really do it justice. Thankfully for me though, I was able to get my hands on a PS5 about a third of the way into this game. After importing my save over and taking advantage of the free PS5 upgrade, it really clicked into place for me, and I highly recommend playing it this way. The better performance really lets the game's peculiar brand of action work a lot better. There's a lot of combos and meters and cooldowns to keep track of, as well as a good amount of enemies that all attack differently and respond differently to different elements, as is typical of these types of games nowadays. And as you can no doubt tell, Scarlet Nexus has a very Japanese take on the genre, with a more than little bit anime aesthetic and a whole bunch of characters, perhaps too many, that all feel like they were ripped right out of anime. This is a semi-post-apocalyptic story where these strange creatures called visitors, which are basically fusions of aliens and random inanimate objects, and you gotta fight them with your own increasingly large roster of telekinetic attacks, as well as borrowing different powers from your party members, which also grows to a pretty long list. The party system itself is also pretty deep and lets you assign different buffs to each character, as well as direct their focus to being more defensive or more aggressive, etc. This definitely puts Scarlet Nexus into the action RPG genre to some extent, but I still largely consider it an action game primarily.
It's ridiculously huge!
You really don't have to pay that much attention to the RPG stuff if you don't want to. It's just kind of there for those that want it. There's also a lot of opportunities to do big damage with objects in the environment, and a lot of these attacks don't quite turn out the way you might think. The combat is really fun and intricate and never really got old for me. My only gripes with the game are just a couple of sections where the action feels purposefully stunted so the game can make you hunt around for keys, and also a couple of sections where you have to use specific powers to move forward. Both of these are pretty rare and short-lived, but they just feel kind of arbitrary and the game really didn't need them. There's also a lot of sections between missions where you talk to other characters and give them gifts, and sometimes go on these big long cutscenes where everybody talks about their pasts and builds their relationships and stuff like that. And some people complain about these sections going on a little bit too long, and I don't disagree, but honestly I enjoyed them for the most part. They're pretty well written and well acted, and if you don't mind a few anime cliches popping up here and there, I think they're perfectly fine to sit through. Plus, if you don't like it, you can skip the vast majority of it. The main story itself is probably the biggest offender of being really tropey and just throwing random twists at you that aren't really earned or given the time to feel very impactful, and it's often just a little bit too complicated for its own good, especially towards the end. But the good news is the action only gets better and better as the game goes along, and that, in my opinion, is what you should come to Scarlet Nexus for.
Nothing you can do! Give up!
The game is also fairly long, with my playthrough taking about 30 hours to finish, and I did very few of the side missions. I also only technically played half the game because you can replay the whole thing with a different character and see everything unfold from their perspective. I only did Kasane's story before moving on to other games, but I figure I'll probably come back and do Yuito's as well at some point. Overall, this is a really great action game here, with a ton of satisfying combat, good enemy variety, and lots of different powers to borrow from different team members and master. It's just got a lot going on. It's a great action game.
I feel reborn.
Despite how far action games have come, the classic foundations of old-school simplicity and straightforward progression popularized by Devil May Cry and God of War and other games like that from the PS2 era still seem to be a perfectly fine starting point for any good action game to build on, and that's exactly what Solstice does. While most would compare the combat in Solstice to Devil May Cry, it actually ended up reminding me more of Visceral's Dante's Inferno than anything else. It just has that slightly more deliberate and weighty feel to it that I actually prefer slightly to the hyperactive DMC style of combat. Its story centers around two sisters, Briar and Lute, who are on a mission to close a tear in the Veil, the cosmic membrane separating their world from a much more sinister one full of monsters. Lute is a powerful ghost, or shade, as she's called, and can wield all sorts of magical abilities, while Briar has achieved supernatural levels of endurance and strength. So they're a pretty good team. You control them in real-time combat and slowly upgrade their movesets as you go. If you've ever played this sort of action game from the PS2 or PS3 era, then you probably already know how to at least jump in and get the hang of the basics, which is definitely one of its better qualities. I think just about anybody can jump into this and have a pretty good time. It's just deep and intricate enough to be a really good version of the type of game that it is. I personally really enjoy the tightly designed, gloomy gothic levels more than just about any other aspect of it, and coming across echoes of the past that provide some context for the story by giving you short glimpses into things that happened in the past is a really nice touch, though some of these segments are more interesting than others.
I can't keep my promise.
Briar and Lute aren't gonna be winning any awards for their character development, but they're pretty fun to get to know. I enjoyed them the more I played them. The control scheme is basically centered around light and heavy attacks, while Lute peppers in projectiles from afar, kinda like how Atreus works in the new God of War games. This is where the blending of old and new starts to show, which is something that you'll notice a lot in Solstice. More overtly noticeable is the often fixed camera that, during battle, usually gives control back to the player and then plays more like a modern action game, but then it's back to panning and trucking around automatically during the platforming and exploration sections, and even during some battles, I guess for that more cinematic look. Both camera systems work fine, but it can be maybe a little bit jarring going back and forth. Managing the banishment and evocation fields, also known as the red and blue stuff, also play a big role by making corresponding enemies vulnerable, barriers breakable, and even revealing platforms that lead to hidden areas and items. Using them too long will hurt Lute though, so there's a little bit of strategy there. Also, there's a unity meter that illustrates the connection between Briar and Lute that can add to the efficiency of combat and even lead to a devastating rapture state where Briar can easily tear through all enemies, fields be damned. All in all, despite the game never really totally shaking its budgety feel in some ways, this is a great action game. It runs really well on the PS5 and feels really natural to slip into for fans of classic action games like me and probably you if you're watching this. Valkyrie Elysium really got a bad rap in my opinion. On one hand, yes, it is further continuing the hack-and-slashification of classic JRPG franchises, and that's something that we've seen happen to Final Fantasy, Tales games, and others. And some folks are understandably disappointed to see that. I totally get that. And the story is also pretty thin, which is another big change for the series, but even still, there's a really fun action game underneath all that. It's actually been one of my favorite action games on the system that I've played so far. Calling on different Enheriars also mixes things up nicely as they imbue your current weapon with their element and execute attacks of their own to help out. It feels kind of like how Scarlet Nexus works, as you learn to mix and match different elements and companions with different enemy types for maximum effect. Although it's not quite as complex as Scarlet Nexus. Taking out stronger and stronger groups of enemies with more and more complex combinations of your own expanding arsenal of swords and spears, divine art attacks, and the increasingly powerful Enheriars is extremely satisfying, especially in the latter half of the game when everything is really cooking and you finally got the hang of everything. The rhythm of recharging your divine art attacks by using your Enheriars and vice versa is a fun one to slip into. Valkyrie Elysium has a really ethereal or kind of ghostly feel to it that makes it stand out thematically to me. The levels themselves might look a little bland and washed out to some, but it also really enhances the vibrant colors that pop off of the screen during combat. Kinda reminds me of looking at a slice of funfetti cake. The few twists and turns of the story itself are predictable ones, but the game wisely keeps cutscenes short and mostly focuses on keeping you in the action. The Inheriars that Valkyrie enlists to help her are all really cool characters that I ultimately grew to enjoy. They're probably the best part of the game's narrative, in fact, as Valkyrie's presence is generally very measured and overly restrained.
Then take my hand.
Valkyrie Elysium's got its problems though, mostly when it comes to Valkyrie's weapons, all feeling a little bit too similar, and the variety of the enemies and the locations leaving a good bit to be desired. But I think most criticisms of those issues are a bit overblown in their severity, especially if you go into the game with the right mindset. It's not trying to reinvent the wheel, it's just trying to give you a flavor of modern action RPG stuff that works well and looks cool, and that it certainly does. But as the combat and abilities expand with a massive moveset and this enormous skill tree system, and all the Inheriars, it really does grow into something special, if you're willing to give it the amount of time that it needs to really blossom. If it looks like you might be into it, it's definitely recommendable from me, especially if you're playing it on a PS5 or a decent PC. If Valkyrie Elysium is a glass of fine wine that takes a while to fully appreciate, then Evil West is a shot of dry whiskey that doesn't give a damn what you think about it. It goes down fast and it hits you like a ton of bricks every step of the way. There's a lot to like with Evil West, from the clearly Dark Watch-inspired setting that mixes a Western theme with overtly violent vampire and werewolf slaying action, to the absolutely awesome combat system that forgoes the weapon wheels and selection screens that a lot of action games like to use, in favor of the most arcadey possible solution ever, attaching single button presses to most of the weapons, and using cooldowns for everything instead of managing actual ammo. Having your shotgun, rifle, pistol, health regeneration, and more all assigned to their own buttons feels a little bit weird at first, but I surprisingly got used to it pretty fast. The game also is clearly designed to play a lot like the new God of War games, with the close-up over-the-shoulder camera style. I think it works pretty well in this game though, even though ultimately it's pretty different from God of War. The game definitely suffers from a lack of enemy variety, but for some reason I was almost never bothered by that. Perhaps it's because the combat itself is pretty nuanced and always evolving into something more. One thing that did bother me though were all the annoying moments where the action ground to a halt and made you solve some stupid puzzle despite that being completely at odds with the tone and style of this game. Seriously, I don't know why every developer still feels the need to cram stuff like this into their action games. It makes sense for some games like Uncharted or maybe Horizon because those games are about literally uncovering hidden secrets, but most action games really don't need this type of stuff. If the action is good, like it is here, then just let that speak for itself. Let that be the game. Don't get in your own way with stupid stuff like this. Anyway, Evil West for the most part stays focused on what it does best, and that's big arenas full of lots of enemies and an ever-expanding list of ways to pummel them into oblivion, or shoot them, or explode them. Despite the undeniable lack of variety in some ways, I was always enjoying the game. There's something about destroying these enemies with Jesse's ridiculous gauntlet that gives God of War 3's Nemean Cestus a run for its money. The game also looks pretty cool with some really intense saturated colors and high contrast, but sadly, in order to run it at 60 frames on your PS5, you will need to have 1080p resolution, which is a little bit of a bummer. There's also a co-op mode and a New Game Plus, which adds a little bit of replay value, and that's always appreciated. But I think the big thing that this game is missing is just a story that matters. Despite the characters being designed really well and acted pretty well, what they're saying and what they're doing is never very interesting. It's a big shame, because I think visually the world that's constructed here is super interesting. The game just doesn't really do anything with it. But in any case, it's a nice tight 12 hours or so, and I think action game fans should definitely not sleep on it. It's the type of game you can finish and then immediately restart on a higher difficulty and never really get bored with, especially if you're a fan of this type of game, which, again, if you've made it this far into this video, you probably are. Well, there you have it. There's a small handful of action games that I think are really good and mostly underrated. If you find yourself agreeing with me, then get out there and buy these games so we can get some more of this type of stuff. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.